Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Shake Sales. I'm your host Maggie, the sales evangelist at Mailshake. And today we have our very own Jed Marley, head of outbound sales at Mailshake, joining me. And I'm super excited to talk with him about coaching a remote team. So I'll let Jed introduce himself, but Jed, thanks so much for being on here.
Yeah, for sure. Excited, Maggie. And also glad you got my name right, too. Everyone says Marl, but I think I heard you say my last name before. So for a second, I was like, is she going to say Marl? Is she going to say Marley? But no, yeah. I've been at Mailshake for close to 6 months now. It's crazy how fast it's gone by. Previously, I was at a company called PandaDoc. I helped build their outbound SDR team over the last 3 years. And yeah, excited to talk about coaching reps in a remote environment, because my entire management and leadership career has been remote. Even though I was in office for the first year of my SaaS career, all my management experience is remote. So I have some interesting insights there, and excited to talk about it.
Yeah, awesome. And I think I got your name right because I've been talking about this with other people, but before I've been doing these interviews, I've done a decent amount of stalking. So even people I work with, clearly, and I've heard you introduce yourself on other webinars. So you're right. I've never said your last name out loud, but I've heard you say it. But cool. Awesome. Yeah. And like you said, you have spent most of, or all of your leadership career coaching remotely, which is super interesting that we'll dive into this. But one thing that I know just from working with you and other people should know but Jed takes his own cold calls, his own discovery calls, his own demos, his own closing calls. So everything in the sales process is if he were a rep, but as a manager. So he does that whole process. And I think it's just amazing. But I'm curious to know, what do you think a manager is missing out on when they don't do this?
Yeah, it's so for me, it's been a little bit easier being at Mailshake, because we had to build the process from scratch. But I think regardless of how big your team is or where you're at, you should always make time to, get in the trenches with them or actually do the job as well. What I think, managers are missing out if they're not doing this is an opportunity to kind of connect with the reps on a deeper level. When we're just coaching, but we're not actually doing it as much, it's harder to really understand their problems or where the gaps in the process might be. So I'm always making sure that I'm testing out the script they're using. I'm testing out the campaigns and doing everything as if I was them, and thinking, how could this be more efficient? Where am I getting stuck? Because if I'm getting stuck, somebody who has experience, who's done this before, then they're definitely getting stuck. So I need to work on improving that process. So you just get much more visibility into what your reps are facing on a day-to-day basis. It also just helps build, more trust with your reps, and they take what you're saying more seriously because they know you're doing it and you have that experience.
Yeah, I think if you're kind of like getting in the dirt with them, especially because, I've been on teams where I've been an SDR, and I think like my manager will tell me to do something. This is probably when I was first an SDR years ago. But I was like, well, how do they know? And I think it's true testament for SDRs that they're thinking like, well, he is on the phones. He is taking these demo calls. He does know what's going on. So I think just getting in the weeds with them is really helpful and figuring out, what are some challenges that are coming up? What are people saying about the product that you need to relay back to a team? So it's like, it can speed up all that communication too with you as a manager instead of relying on your SDRs to communicate all that too.
Yeah, 100%. I like my golden rule. I forget. I don't know who to give credit to this for, but something that stuck with me is like, never tell your reps to do something that you haven't done or that you wouldn't do yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Because how can you coach on it at the end of the day?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. So yeah, more into coaching. So again, I stalked your newsletter before this. It's funny, like I take all these skills from being an SDR and put them into whatever I do now. So like my favorite part of being an SDR was prospecting. So, which people would call me crazy because they're like, oh, that's so annoying. Like I hate, finding people or whatever, but I love doing it. But in your newsletter, you said that, you had a coach and a manager at some point that you felt like was the opposite personality of yourself. So they were like loud, they had brands, or they went on rants when they try to motivate a team. And I know something you said is you felt a little bit intimidated about that when you first became a manager. So you thought, I'm not like this. I'm a little bit maybe more reserved, we can call it.
Yeah.
And yeah, like how have you debunked that stereotype and, found your own beat to motivating a remote team?
Yeah, it's tough because like the perception of sales is that everybody's super loud and extroverted, and then sales leadership is that times 20, right? You're even louder. It's like if you've seen The Wolf of Wall Street, that's your perception of like what a sales would be like. And I think it definitely works in some cultures, and there's definitely sales leaders like the sales leader I had that was super loud, got me motivated and fired up every day, and there's definitely merit to that. However, I don't think it's necessary, and that was a big thing that I was like anxious about or nervous about becoming an SDR or sales leader was I'm not that type of person. I'm not like super loud and aggressive, but that's okay. And kind of how I came to terms with that was one, really understanding that first of all, as a sales rep, you don't have to be extroverted or introverted. There's really no like, it's just a stereotype. So kind of A, understanding that, and then B, understanding that like reps get motivated by more so by what you do and what you're able to do for them, not necessarily just are you loud, are you gonna get me riled up like that. That's part of it, sure, but you can get motivated and riled up by seeing your manager do what like we just talked about, doing what you're coaching on, or seeing what they have done in their career and getting motivated by that. So that was a big thing. I just started to learn and understand that, and it helped me get more comfortable in my own management skin, if you will, where I didn't feel like I had to pretend to be somebody else. And that's the other thing too, is that like coaching reps, it's really about, and like managing reps, you have to be your most authentic self with them. Because to get somebody motivated, bought into doing something that's really hard, like outbound sales, you have to be able to connect with them. And if they feel like you're trying too hard to be this type of person you're not, it's really hard to make that connection. So it's really just in your best interest to be as authentic as you can.
Yeah. And I think that authenticity comes too with like owning up to your mistakes as a manager. This is me not speaking. I've never been a manager before, like interim manager when someone was out, but yeah, owning up to your mistakes. Like I've had managers in the past where, where they kind of were like, hey, I messed up, or, I thought this was going to work and it didn't. And I think that comes out with authenticity too, because a lot of people will think like, I'm the manager, I can't like let them, see me vulnerable or something like that. And I think you do a really good job as a manager being your authentic self with the good and the bad. And I think that's important too, to be motivated by. Yeah,
like being vulnerable, that's huge. I'm glad you touched on that, like being vulnerable with your team. When they feel like you're perfect, you don't make mistakes, it makes it harder for them to make mistakes. You feel like you're walking on eggshells. And like even for myself, like my bosses, the people I report to, if they can admit to me they made mistakes, when they're, they talk about their mistakes, they make mistakes, they admit to them, they admit they're wrong. It kind of makes me feel more comfortable to make mistakes myself, which is what I want my reps to do. I want them to kind of step outside the boundaries and, make mistakes, mess up, and learn from them. But if I'm never showing that, then it makes me a lot less authentic. It's harder for them to feel comfortable with making mistakes.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up a good point too for your reps. Like you want them to be able to make mistakes and, try things out. I mean, that's kind of part of it. When you start testing things, there's going to be mistakes made in there. And I was just talking with someone about this earlier today about how you can't be afraid to test things out in cold email, because cold email is ever evolving. You need to, something that someone posted on their LinkedIn profile, something probably I did 3 months ago that I posted on my LinkedIn profile that worked, may not work for me today. And you've had great success in cold email as a sales leader. How do you coach or train your team to have the same success?
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing about cold email is that if you have to teach frameworks with your reps, not tactics, because tactics get really old. For the longest time, it was just a quick question, Maggie, question mark. Those subject lines would get me tons of open rates as an SDR in late 2019, early 2020. And then nobody opens that anymore because it's just, they get overused. So that's kind of how it is, especially if you're in SaaS sales, selling to SaaS sales leaders. They just know all the tactics, which I know is probably a lot of people listening to this podcast. they know the tactics. So tactics dry up really, really, really fast. And so, sure, I might teach my reps new tactics, but more so I try to teach them frameworks so they can think on their own in terms of like, how should you structure an email? What should go into the first sentence? What should the call to action look like? What should the value prop look like? What should the length be? The copywriting style, things of that nature. I just try to teach them frameworks, and then I also give them resources for them to learn and kind of be on the cutting edge of some of these new tactics, because new little tips and tricks, they definitely help me a lot as an SDR, but it's about being one of the first people to use them and apply them in your strategy before they kind of get old. And so teaching them where to look for those things, like who are the good people to follow on LinkedIn, what are the good books to read, good podcasts to listen to. Like, I'll give you a good example. There was one that was on LinkedIn the other day where it was a really strong follow-up email. It was just Maggie ?
I saw that.
In your first email, and then the next one was just like Maggie ? And I was like, that's great. And Dasanka on our team, she found that, and now she's starting to use it. But I'm sure something like that's going to get overused in the next 6 months. So the frameworks that are never going to really get old, but then also teach them to look for those new tactics, where to look for them. It's just the way I approach it.
Yeah, I love that. So just saying, the framework is what's going to be most important. You can test out tactics. There might be some tactics in there that work. And definitely look at LinkedIn for new ideas, but just make sure that those are getting refreshed in the mix of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And I know another thing. So I think you brought up earlier, I kind of like to call it the triple threat. Like, we're in it. We're salespeople selling sales software to other salespeople. So like, we talk about sales all day long. We, take in content from LinkedIn, podcasts, things like that. And something I heard recently, and I keep hearing it again and again, is like, sales leaders talk about this, because typically people in sales leadership roles, like even like yourself, you started as an SDR in an office. And then you started as leadership going, remote. But now a lot of SDRs are, just starting out in a remote world. They're by themselves in their apartment. And, there's kind of this argument that SDRs should all be in an office. And then maybe later on when they become an AE or they're in leadership, that, then they can have that experience of being remote. So obviously, you've clearly had success with the opposite, coaching and training a remote team of SDRs. So how do you keep a remote SDR team engaged?
Yeah. First, I'll be honest, I don't think remote, in terms of like how to coach a brand new SDR, compares to being in the office. I think being in the office is honestly the best way to coach an SDR, but that's not to say that's the only way to do it. You can still be really successful remote, which I've found some ideas, but I remember being an SDR in the office. You just get to hear other people on the sales floor, listen to their calls, get feedback. It's kind of nerve-wracking. I was sitting 2 seats over from the CRO who would overhear my cold calls. I was very that helps you build thick skin. So it's hard to replace what's in the office, but what I try to do from my remote coaching standpoint is rebuild what's in the office as much as possible and the value you get from being in an office. And so what that kind of entails is, we have, with any of my SDR teams, we always have, like, first thing in the morning is just daily calls, whether that's 10 minutes to 30 minutes. We'll do role plays. We'll just kind of try to get the marbles out of our mouths to start calling for the day. Do role plays, review goals from the week, review how the day before went, run competitions, spiffs, listen to call recordings. Basically, each day of the week, we have a new agenda to keep things interesting, especially when you're an SDR, like you said, maybe alone in your apartment making cold calls all day. You're not talking to anybody. You're getting rejected all day. I've been there. I've been there in the middle of quarantine in an attic doing that, getting hung up on all day, and it sucks. So connecting every day, just like talking about, listening to just calls that went bad together and having that camaraderie with the rest of the team has been the most important thing in terms of coaching a remote team. So like daily stand-ups. And the second thing in terms of like building that office environment is having like Zoom dial sessions with the team where we all jump on a Zoom call. There's tools like Nooks that kind of are cool with helping this and like building that office environment, but you can also get away with it on a Zoom call. And, it's important, like me as a manager, I'm in there dialing with them as well. Anytime we get to connect, we're unmuting so the rest of the team can listen. And then just like running creative competitions and spiffs. Like, I'll give you an example. one I'm doing right now with Caesar and Desanko, who are two SDRs on my team, is whoever books the most demos this week, I'm changing my LinkedIn profile picture to their face for like 3 days. So it's just like,
That's awesome.
yeah, it doesn't always have to be like a money prize thing. Sometimes you do something like that where it's just a little bit different, and it makes things a little fun, a little more fun. Almost said funner.
Hey, it can be funner too. But you talked about an important thing, and I'm just thinking back to my time as an SDR too. I was in an office, and yeah, I even think to myself now, like, I mean, there's some days where you're in leadership or in the role I'm in, or as an AE or anything, where you feel like you're on a lonely island because you work remote. So these tips I feel like could be helpful for people in other roles of just like how to find connection when working remote, but also especially for SDRs, because I remember I would have bad calls, and I mean, I would straight up almost start tearing up like to my friend next to me and then tell them like, this person just called me bleep, bleep, bleep. And like, yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what do they do now when that happens? Like, that is crazy. So having like, I'm sure some of those moments may happen when you have dial sessions together, but that's a great idea of doing it. Of trying to replicate those things that, you know, it's not replacing it, but finding alternatives there.
100%. Yeah.
No, that's funny. And, yeah, it's good tactics to take away from it. But Jed, thank you so much for going through that. Any other tips that you give a sales leader, you know, that's coaching a remote team right now?
Those are the big ones. I mean, there's some other things that come to mind as well. Like, I like to review, like I kind of touched on earlier, making sure that you're reviewing new content, whether that's from LinkedIn, books, courses, things like that, kind of like what you're doing with the team right now. Do like deep dives into courses or book reviews on a regular basis, where you're having the team kind of present on that information themselves and what they've learned. Review videos.
Review this video.
Yeah, review this video. Like doing those sort of things and then putting it in the reps' hands to like run those calls and say, here's what I learned. Just basically like weekly get-togethers where you're like learning something new. Is a really good way to empower, especially SDRs or like newer sales reps, because one of the biggest things they're looking for and that empowers them and keeps them motivated is like, am I continuously learning? And so if you can continue to make them feel like they're learning something new, they're growing as a salesperson beyond just that company, that's huge. So include some sort of weekly education where you're putting some responsibility on the reps. It's another good way for everybody to kind of grow together, stay motivated. That's probably the last thing I'll leave the audience with.
Yeah, awesome. No, I totally agree. And yeah, a couple takeaways that I've heard that you talked about today is really just being authentic and vulnerable with your team as a sales leader, helping them grow in ways. So giving them more responsibility is going to make them feel more valued. And making sure that they're staying on top of content, you're repurposing it with them, and they can talk about it as well. So thanks so much. Before we finish up here, where can people find you to learn more about you?
LinkedIn. Search AED, and there's not too many Jeds, so you'll probably see my name.
Awesome. Jed, thanks so much for joining us today, and I will catch everyone next time on Shake Sales. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie.